you mentioned Steve Jobs, and I think he has been lionized to a great degree since his death, and probably deservedly so. There are some sort of minority reports about how he was an asshole to people at work and so on and so forth. But on net, the guy's a pretty fantastic leader. But I remember when when he was sick, when he died, the writer Schulz wrote an article about him, and it was a fantastic article about Steve Jobs and about how Steve Jobs was a failure many times over, and how his great success did not come without dealing with those series of failures. Can you talk about that a little bit? And what I think is the punchline of that piece is the importance of failure to our well-being overall.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of interesting points to make about Jobs. One is that, right, obviously his successes, we have iTunes and iPhones and iPads, and I'm doing this on, a MacBook Air right now, and all these great products that people love, and he helped bring those into existence. But, he had a number of extraordinary failures along the way. People forget that he was actually kicked out of Apple, and then eventually came back. But that is the nature of entrepreneurial activity. I mean, there are very few true entrepreneurs that haven't had some failures along the way. And part of it is that there's a learning process. I mean, there's a trial and error, and you need some errors in order to have genuine trial and error, whereby you learn what works in the marketplace. What works to satisfy consumer wants and demands, or to create new consumer wants and demands. So you're not going to get it 100% right every time, and we need to have a culture that is accepting of failure, that permits it, and that understands that it's not something that's necessarily shameful, but that can be a wellspring for future creative activity. Your point about Steve Jobs and people pointing out that maybe he wasn't the nicest guy in the world, this is exactly why it's important to try to channel genuine entrepreneurial energy into the private sector and away from the public sector. I mean, imagine if Steve Jobs had been in political life. Imagine if he was a senator or a president. I don't know that those are the kinds of qualities that you actually want in somebody who's a public servant or a bureaucrat. And yet, if you have the institutional mix such that anybody of enormous ambition feels that they must be compelled to go into the public sector, you end up with that. You end up with he was sort of a tyrant, right? I want my tyrants going into the private sector. I don't want them going into the public sector. So, it's an important, if he could have been some tin pot African dictator, and that would have been a really bad thing. But instead, he was in a place where free enterprise is still celebrated and championed, and everybody was better off because of that. His monomaniacal focus on things probably isn't conducive to him being a good bureaucrat per se, but it was conducive to him building a private sector company that was enormously beneficial for mankind.
Well, and that's interesting that you talk about the possibility of Steve Jobs being a dictator, because as Madison said, there are no angels. But I think if we can talk about angels, I think you're pretty damn close.